Hey everyone! So our Legal Aliens pilot is finally up on Pompred TV, so I can finally turn my attention to my long list of tutorials that I promised. On which subject I have uploaded a walkthrough of how I read characters' faces on the Pomprod channel. Feel free to check that out. We'll keep more of the step-by-step guides on this channel though. Today though, I wanted to quickly touch upon something that a lot of grease pencil users seem to be doing, and it's wasting their time and making scenes unnecessarily complex to manage. And the users I've spoken to don't even realise there's an alternative. And that's using the perspective camera no matter what they're animating. Today I'm going to try and explain when you're going to want to use a perspective camera and when you're going to want to just use an orthographic.
Oh, bloody glorious now.
I'll also provide my tips on using the perspective camera to avoid these issues when you have to use it, and these will be at the end of the video. I should start by saying this will apply to animators looking to recreate the traditional 2D animation style, the cutout style that you'll see in animations like BoJack Horseman, The Simpsons, Rick and Morty, Futurama, American Dad, Family Guy, and so on. The mistakes and examples I'm about to show you are from my own work when I first started experimenting with grease pencil. As much as I loved the 3D camera and how much depth it gives to the scene, I found it too finicky to manage simple scenes, and it made my layouts more complex than they needed to be. So instead, I moved over to a fully 2D setup, which is much quicker to animate the type of animation I'm making, and I revert to perspective camera where I need an elaborate shot, like this diving shot of the roof. So let me quickly explain why this is a problem. A perspective camera is essentially a 3D camera and works like a real-world counterpart. These were a revelation to animation and enable us to make some crazy camera shots, as these can be moved anywhere in 3D space. The problem being that we're filming flat 2D grease pencil objects with 3D's perspective, so things can look a little bit flat or wrong. For example, you might notice an artifact called creeping with these cameras, where the positioning of an object causes the perspective to be off and the object creeps in a direction or in a way that looks unnatural. This tree, or this table, for example. In addition, if the object is not directly facing the camera, we lose all dimension, and the object looks flat, like this character running. This all becomes most obvious and tedious when you have an object moving in between layers, like this simple car scene. To an audience, it's really nothing special, but it's actually got quite a few layers going on here. That's because our character is simultaneously in front of the car, in the car, and behind the car. As well, we need to be able to move those layers as our character's arm moves from in front of the car into the car. Here's how it looks in Blender with the orthographic camera. Because we've used orthographic, we're able to make the layers very obvious, so it's quick to organise when animating. If we were to use a perspective camera here, we would need our objects to all be very close together to avoid creeping, which makes it trickier to organise when animating, and can get a little bit messy when you've got this many layers interacting with each other. That seems like a lot of extra work to us when we really don't gain anything using perspective in this shot. Whereas in orthographic, we can ignore the dimension and keep our 2D animation 2D. Now a meticulous planner will be able to ensure the scale, positioning and distance of the objects are correct and appropriate for the focal length of the camera to avoid the creeping. This takes some accuracy though, and time. Others will draw additional dimensions to their grease pencil object to negate the flatness. But again, this isn't a quick solution and requires you to think in 3D. We don't always want that in 2D, and so that's my argument. In its simplest form, if your scene is 2D, save yourself time by making your 2D scene in 2D. But I want to break it down a little further. Let's look at how the professionals use these tools.
Oh my god, he's got a gun! Relax, it's a lighter. How much lighter fluid can I take on the plane?
Most 2D animations, like the ones I listed earlier, rarely use a 3D camera, or our default perspective here in Blender. These cartoons are probably made in Toon Boom, which is a layer-based animation tool. Let me show you some examples of this at work in professional cartoons. This scene in Rick and Morty is currently a 2D camera, until this elaborate camera dive, which is all in 3D perspective, switching back once the move is complete. Now, you can clearly see the difference in appearance between the 2D and 3D scene when looking at the characters side by side. An animator is likely to have had to draw the extra dimension to all these ricks to accomplish a flying shot like this because of all of the rick's hair. Again, it's a great cinematic shot, but it feels different, doesn't it? The characters don't quite look the same. The same method is often used in mainstream animation for vehicles, spaceships, or action shots. Moving cars are tricky to draw, for example, so the animators save time and have a 3D vehicle that they can either rotoscope over or apply a toon shader to make the 3D look 2D. Here in Futurama, you'll see Fry and Leela are 2D, while Santa is a 3D model. They're separate renders, so it's easy to sew these together. Santa switches back to 2D as soon as the complex sleigh move has stopped. So you can see the industry only uses 3D camera shots where they need to, reverting back to 2D at the very earliest opportunity. So let's try and explain how an orthographic camera works, with the wonders of Disney.
This is the plan for a super cartoon camera. We call it the multiplane camera.
Back in the 1930s, Disney pioneered a manual multiplane camera for 2D cell animation. This method has been digitalized and is ultimately similar to the camera in Blender now.
The problem was how to take a painting and make it behave like a real piece of scenery under the camera. The trouble was we were photographing a flat two-dimensional background. So we set about making plans and blueprints for a new cartoon camera that would overcome this. The different elements in the scene were separated according to their varying distances from the viewer. This put the moon on a plane farthest away from the camera. With our original picture broken down in this manner, it is possible to control the relative speed with which each individual part of it moves to or away from the camera. But the moon remains absolutely still, and so it will always remain the same, neither growing nor shrinking in size. And here now is our same moonlight scene, the way the multiplane camera sees it. As you can see, we finally got the moon to keep its proper distance.
I highly recommend watching this video about 2D animation actually if you're interested. Unlike a perspective camera, objects closer to the camera don't appear any larger. Instead, the 3D space works more like a way to manage layers. We can forget the minute adjustments required in perspective cam to ensure we keep perspective and move our objects more broadly. We effectively turn Blender into a layer animation tool like Toon Boom using this camera. So what can we do in orthographic and what can't we do? Well, we can pan as usual, we can zoom by changing the orthographic scale of the camera, changing our scene size. If we want to give the impression of perspective that we've lost, we can simply scale our objects. The benefit here being that we control the scale of the objects rather than the perspective camera giving us the control. So if all we need to do is zoom and pan, which is mostly true of all the cartoons I mentioned above, then all we need is orthographic cameras. If we need something more complex, then it's time to call on the perspective camera. The camera shots I've referenced are great examples of how the industry uses 3D within 2D to accomplish great shots. Look at the background in F is for Family here. It's detailed, in perspective and looks great. To my eye, this looks like a 3D camera. Whilst if we look at an old 2D frame by frame of the same event in an old Simpsons for instance, it's a very simple set of repeating frames, because this type of drawing is very time consuming and very difficult. Initially I wanted shots like this in Illegal Aliens. I mocked up a really quick chase scene as well. As test goes, it certainly passed, but the amount of additional drawing required meant this would take too much time to achieve for the significance of the shot, which is the story of most animation. Most work won't be an animator's finest work, it'll be their most efficient. So we ended up with shots like this. Nothing wrong with it, it's just a bit blander. When it's time to use perspective, or if you just don't like orthographic, here's some tips. Firstly, make sure all the objects belonging to the same character or item are very close together on the Z axis. This will avoid creeping in your shots. If you're using a 3D camera for a camera move, make sure you've drawn or modelled the protrusions on an object. You can see here in the dive shot discussed earlier that the window ledges and brickwork of the building are extruding. This makes the shot feel 3D instead of a camera looking at something 2D. Ensure your flat objects are perpendicular to the camera so they don't appear flat. That means that flat objects have to face the camera head on. You can actually set up a driver that will always face the camera to achieve this automatically. To assist with the depth of field, you will also need to make sure your scales are correct. A human is not 5 meters tall, for example. Make sure you draw things to their real life size because it does have an effect on the camera and depth of field when you come to rendering. So hopefully this video has taught you something about cameras in Blender. I might not have got you to convert, but hopefully this will help you understand when it is and when it isn't a great situation to use each method. Feel free to ask any questions in the comments. I do share my grease pencil animations on this channel and PomProd if you'd like some more content. If you found this video helpful, please give us a thumbs up and subscribe for more grease pencil content. I'm now going to get re-recording my next tutorial before Blender updates again and it's all different. Until next time guys.